The last 48 hours of Michael Jackson. What if the most protected man in music died, surrounded by people whose entire job was to keep him safe? And none of them could stop it? That is the strange, uncomfortable truth at the center of what happened at 100 North Carrollwood Drive on June 25, 2009. This is a reconstruction built from trial testimony, coroner's records, and phone logs entered into evidence. Not speculation, but the documented sequence of a death that took place behind locked doors while an entire household went about its mourning as if nothing were wrong. Before we get into the final hours, ask yourself something. If you were surrounded by bodyguards, a personal chef, a nanny, and a physician on call 24 hours a day, do you think anyone could actually save you from yourself? Keep that question in mind, because by the end of the story you may not be sure of the answer. A tour that was never going to happen the way everyone hoped. By the spring of 2009, Michael Jackson had agreed to something enormous. 50 consecutive shows at London's O2 Arena, branded "This Is It." On paper, it was a comeback for the ages. In practice, it was a countdown clock strapped to a man whose body had already been pushed past its limits for decades. Rehearsals ran late into the night at the Staples Center. Choreography that would have exhausted a performer half his age was demanded of a 50-year-old whose weight had visibly dropped in the weeks leading up to the run. Kenny Ortega, the show's director, had grown concerned enough to raise the alarm with production executives days before the tragedy, warning that Jackson looked depleted and unwell. Financially, the promoter carried enormous exposure if the tour collapsed, and that pressure did not stay contained to a boardroom. It filtered down, quietly, into every hour of Jackson's schedule. Two bodyguards who worked closest to him in those final months, Bill Whitfield and Javon Beard, would later describe a man who was unraveling in slow motion, withdrawn, sleepless, increasingly isolated even inside his own home. They watched it happen and, by their own account, felt powerless to intervene. The final rehearsal. On the night of June 24th, Jackson took the stage at the Staples Center for what turned out to be his last rehearsal. By every account from those in the room, he seemed present, sharp, and engaged. He ran through Billie Jean and Earth Song with the crew, offered direction to his dancers, and even slipped in a version of his signature moonwalk. Lifted on a cherry-picker platform above the stage as the session wrapped near midnight, he thanked his team warmly before heading to his car. Nobody in that arena had any reason to think it was the last time they would see him perform. Behind the gates on Carrollwood Drive, the motorcade left downtown Los Angeles shortly after midnight and made its way to Holmby Hills, to a rented French-style estate that had become Jackson's temporary refuge from public life. The house was designed deliberately to be a fortress of privacy. Staff had signed non-disclosure agreements. The doors to the upper floor were kept locked to almost everyone. Only a small circle had regular access to that part of the house. A personal chef named Kai Chase, a nanny for the 3 children, and, crucially, a cardiologist named Conrad Murray, who had been brought on specifically to manage Jackson's chronic sleep problems. Murray was stationed upstairs that night, waiting. Here's something worth sitting with. Jackson's insomnia had been documented for years, dating back to his grueling world tours of the 1990s. By 2009, conventional treatments had stopped working for him. He had come to rely on propofol, a powerful surgical anesthetic never intended for use as a sleep aid outside a hospital setting, administering it nightly with Murray's help. Ask yourself why a cardiologist with no formal anesthesiology training would agree to manage that kind of drug regimen in a private bedroom, with no monitoring equipment in sight. A habit years in the making. To understand why Jackson trusted propofol so completely, you have to go back further than that one night. Colleagues and former staff described his sleep troubles as something that had followed him for most of his adult life, worsening dramatically during the grueling stretches of his world tours in the 1990s, when weeks would pass with almost no real rest between shows, rehearsals, and travel. Over time, conventional sleep aids stopped being enough. He came to believe, according to people close to him, that only a deep, surgical-grade anesthetic could give him the kind of oblivion his exhausted body seemed to need. That belief is what made him so insistent with Murray. It is also what should have been the loudest possible warning sign to any physician willing to listen. Propofol is not a sleep medication. It is used in hospitals under constant supervision, specifically because it can stop breathing within moments if dosing or monitoring goes even slightly wrong. Somewhere along the way, an anesthetic reserved for operating rooms became, in Jackson's own words, something as routine as a nightcap. How does something that dangerous become that normalized inside one man's daily life, without a single person outside that bedroom stepping in to stop it? A long night of sedatives. According to the timeline established at trial, Murray began working to get Jackson to sleep around 1:30 in the morning, starting with a dose of lorazepam. When that failed, he moved through additional sedatives over the following hours, including midazolam. Each drug bought a little time, but none produced the deep, artificial unconsciousness Jackson had grown dependent on. As morning arrived and Jackson still had not slept, he reportedly grew increasingly insistent, asking repeatedly for the substance he referred to privately as his milk. Investigators later reconstructed that around 10:40 a.m. Murray administered a dose of propofol. Within a short window, Jackson's breathing stopped and his heart went into arrest. Standard medical protocol for propofol sedation requires constant, uninterrupted monitoring, pulse oximetry, airway management, someone physically present and watching. None of that was in place. Phone records introduced as evidence showed Murray making a string of personal and business calls during the period he should have been observing his patient, including an extended call to his girlfriend and conversations with staff at a clinic he ran out of state. While he was occupied, Jackson's oxygen levels were falling with no alarm to signal it. A normal morning in the kitchen. Downstairs, none of this was visible. Chef Kai Chase arrived around 8 that morning and began preparing breakfast for the 3 children. Fruit, granola, fresh juice. It was, by her account, an entirely ordinary start to the day. Jackson himself was too exhausted to eat. Then, sometime around noon, everything changed. Chase heard frantic footsteps and shouting from the floor above. Murray burst into the kitchen, visibly panicked, and told her to get security and get Prince immediately. Chase moved quickly to shield the children from what was unfolding upstairs, unaware of exactly what had happened, but certain it was serious. What the bodyguard found. Security officer Alberto Alvarez was called up to the bedroom and later testified about what greeted him. Murray was attempting CPR on an unresponsive Jackson. According to Alvarez's sworn testimony, Murray instructed him, before anything else, to gather medication vials scattered around the room and place them into bags, a request that would later become one of the most damaging pieces of testimony against him. Only after that did Murray have Alvarez call for emergency help. This is where the story gets genuinely troubling. Murray would later claim he had only stepped out briefly and discovered Jackson unresponsive around 11, with a faint pulse still present. But Alvarez testified that when he entered the room closer to noon, Jackson's eyes were open, his skin had already cooled, and a catheter was in place. Physical signs consistent with someone who had been without a pulse for far longer than Murray's account suggested. Which version do you believe? The one told to police, or the one written on the body itself? 32 missing minutes. Cell phone records became one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. They showed that instead of calling 911 the moment he found Jackson in distress, Murray placed a call to a woman named Saad Anding, a cocktail waitress he knew socially, and stayed on the line with her for roughly half an hour. She later testified that the call ended abruptly, with muffled sounds and voices in the background before it cut off. During that window, the exact window when immediate emergency response could have mattered most, Alvarez says Murray was directing him to clear evidence from the room rather than get help. It was not until 12:21 p.m. that the 911 call was finally placed. The call that changed everything. The emergency call itself, played later in open court, remains one of the most unsettling pieces of audio connected to the case. Alvarez can be heard pleading for an ambulance and stating that Jackson was not breathing. In the background, Murray's voice is audible asking whether anyone present knew proper CPR technique. a question that, on its own, raised serious doubts about his competence in that moment. When he attempted compressions, witnesses and later medical analysis indicated he used a flawed one-handed technique that would have been largely ineffective on a patient lying on a soft mattress. Paramedics on the scene. Los Angeles Fire Department paramedics reached the mansion within about 5 minutes of the call. What they found matched Alvarez's account far more closely than Murray's. Paramedic Richard Sinneff later testified that Jackson showed no shockable heart rhythm, had fixed and dilated pupils, and that the surrounding conditions suggested his collapse had happened well before anyone called for help. Despite this, protocol required paramedics to defer to the physician on scene. Murray, identifying himself as Jackson's personal doctor, insisted on continued resuscitation and transport to a hospital rather than allowing the paramedics to make an on-scene determination. So they intubated him, administered emergency cardiac medication, and prepared him for transport, even though the clinical signs already pointed to a grim outcome. The drive nobody rushed. Perhaps one of the most quietly devastating details in the entire timeline is how the ambulance made its way to UCLA Medical Center. There were no sirens, no urgent weaving through traffic. The vehicle moved at a measured pace for the roughly 2.5 miles to the hospital, because the paramedics inside already understood, professionally, that speed would not change the outcome. Murray, meanwhile, continued chest compressions in the back and, according to later accounts, even raised the question of whether sedation might be appropriate en route, a detail so strange that investigators would return to it repeatedly. During the case, Trauma Room 9, at UCLA, emergency physician Rochelle Cooper took over, ordering continued CPR, advanced airway support, and central intravenous access in a last effort to restore a heartbeat. Specialists worked for roughly an hour. Murray, by multiple accounts, stood off to the side, visibly shaken, unable to fully process what was happening in front of him. At 2:26 p.m. on June 25, 2009, Dr. Cooper pronounced Michael Jackson dead. A family learns the truth. Jackson's 3 children arrived at the hospital with their nanny and security detail, having no idea what awaited them. When hospital staff delivered the news, 11-year-old Paris broke down, repeating that she wanted her father and wanted to go with him. 12-year-old Prince stood in visible shock. The youngest, 7-year-old Blanket, clung to his caretaker, too young to fully process what was happening. Katherine Jackson, Michael's mother, was overcome with grief on arrival. Staff who witnessed the scene later described it as one of the hardest moments of their careers, a private tragedy playing out under the weight of a story that was already becoming a global headline. What the search warrant uncovered. When investigators searched the Carrollwood property, what they found painted a picture of an unregulated, makeshift clinic operating out of a private bedroom. 11 vials of propofol, 3 of them empty. Opened containers of lorazepam and midazolam. An oxygen tank and an 4-pole with a cut saline bag. Evidence consistent with a hurried attempt to clear the scene before authorities arrived. Prescription bottles were later found tucked inside closets and even a diaper bag. Subpoenaed pharmacy records showed Murray had ordered several gallons of propofol from a Las Vegas supplier for delivery to an address connected to his girlfriend, an almost unimaginable quantity for private, unsupervised use. Notably absent from the room, any patient chart, any monitoring device, anything resembling a standard of care. What the autopsy revealed. The following day, the Los Angeles County Chief Medical Examiner conducted a full autopsy. Aside from surgical scars, patches of vitiligo, and cosmetic tattooing, Jackson's internal organs were reported to be in remarkably good condition for a man of 50, with no significant heart disease or organ failure found. The real story was in the toxicology screen. Lethal concentrations of propofol layered on top of multiple benzodiazepines, including lorazepam, midazolam, and diazepam. The official cause of death was ruled a homicide, the result of acute propofol intoxication combined with sedative use, administered without appropriate medical justification or monitoring. 2 different stories from Conrad Murray. 2 days after Jackson's death, detectives sat down with Murray for roughly 3 hours. His first version of events was that he had given Jackson mild sedatives, nothing close to full anesthesia. That story fell apart quickly once investigators produced pharmacy records documenting enormous propofol purchases. Under that pressure, Murray shifted his account, claiming Jackson had been receiving nightly propofol infusions for 6 consecutive weeks at his own insistence. What Murray could never adequately explain were the missing minutes, the phone calls made while his patient lay unmonitored, or why the medication vials had vanished from the room before paramedics arrived. Do those inconsistencies sound to you like panic, or like something closer to a cover story? A courtroom reckoning. Nearly 2 years after that afternoon in Holmby Hills, Conrad Murray stood trial for involuntary manslaughter. The prosecution built its case almost entirely around the timeline reconstructed from phone records, witness testimony, and forensic evidence, the same trail this story has just walked through. Jurors heard the emergency call played in full. They heard paramedics describe a body that showed signs of having been gone for longer than Murray admitted. They heard toxicology results that left little room for alternative explanations. In November 2011, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Murray was sentenced to 4 years, though he was released after serving roughly 2, and the California Medical Board later revoked his license to practice medicine. For many who had followed the case, the sentence felt strikingly small compared to the scale of what had been lost. Does 2 years served feel proportionate to you, given everything the evidence in this case actually showed? The bigger picture. It's worth stepping back and asking what actually put Jackson in that room in the first place. The pressure of 50 sold-out shows sat on the shoulders of a performer already struggling physically, while the promoter behind the tour carried enormous financial exposure of its own if the run collapsed, a tension that would later surface publicly in a wrongful death lawsuit brought by the Jackson family. Whatever the legal outcome of that case, the underlying picture is hard to ignore. A global icon, isolated behind locked doors, dependent on a drug never meant to be used this way, cared for by one man operating with no oversight and no equipment appropriate to the risk he was taking on. An empty house. By mid-afternoon on June 25th, the mansion at 100 North Carrollwood Drive had gone eerily quiet. Jackson's children were quietly taken from the property. Staff were let go. The gates were shut as police vehicles patrolled the perimeter and news helicopters circled overhead. Inside, everything remained frozen exactly as it had been the night before, half-finished plates left in the kitchen, an elaborate gilded throne still standing near the entrance, untouched. So here's the question worth leaving you with. In a house full of people whose job was to protect him, who actually failed Michael Jackson that night, and could any one of them have stopped it if they had simply been allowed through that locked door a few hours earlier? If this reconstruction gave you a clearer picture of what really happened behind those doors, let us know which details surprised you most, and stick around for the next investigation into one of music's most talked about mysteries.